Great. Aitsquel, Aikwanasilam Nama. Good day. It's good to see everyone. Welcome to the Business Committee meeting. It is with great respect and humility. We would like to acknowledge and honor the lands of the Sinixic people. Sinixic people maintain their profound, unique, and spiritual connection to the land through ageless traditions, teachings, stewardships, and expressions of reciprocity. Are there any changes, additions, or deletions to the agenda? You could just type that in the chat. Okay, seeing none, I'll seek for a motion to approve the agenda. Mark Robinson. There's a seconder. Thanks, Chantel. And then I will seek for a approval that the minutes of the Business Committee meeting held on December 13th, 2023 be approved. Chantel and Leanna, thank you. You have no presentations this evening. So moving on to senior staff reports 8.1, Mark Walsh, Secretary Treasurer, and Tanya Sutton, Associate Secretary Treasurer, RE the amended budget. Welcome.
Great. Hi, Chair, and good evening, everyone. Just going to start off right off the bat by just acknowledging Tanya and her team for the great work they do in helping put together this report. This evening, the overarching theme, with perhaps the exception of the final item on the agenda, is actually going to be a pretty good news story for our district. And so I'll start us off in a good way in that regard. And I've asked Ms. Matthews to highlight a couple of pages. So the first report that we're viewing tonight is the amended annual budget, and you will see that there's recommended motions. One is that the board agree to pass the amended annual bylaw in one meeting, and so that needs to be not unanimous tonight, but it needs to be unanimous at the actual meeting. And then the second is actually the bylaw itself. And so what we're looking at is the report does two things. One, it updates our budget from our preliminary budget. So way back in May and June, the board passes a preliminary budget that we say, here's what we think our revenues are going to be, and here's what we think our expenses are going to be. Of course, that changes as enrollment fluctuates, as ISE revenues change, as investment revenues change, etc., and as well as when we get ministerial support for, in this case, labor settlement funding, exempt compensation increases, and the like. So what that means is a significant difference from our preliminary budget to our amended annual budget, which is quite normal. Tonight's a bit different in the sense that actually there's a fair amount of discrepancy, particularly in the amount of additional staffing that we've added. And so some good news, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The second thing this does is it's giving the board that financial accountability, or holding us financially accountable, and getting to review how we are doing vis-a-vis spending on a quarterly basis. And so we'll see that this is reflective of 2 quarters of our fiscal year. And if you recall, our fiscal starts in July. So the July and August are months where most of our employees are not working, and so we can anticipate that the expense associated with those employees should be 40%. So because they're really working 10 months, 4 out of 10 months, so 40% is kind of the magic number, whereas some staff, of course, admin, exempt, are 12-month employees. Some of our support staff are as well. So when we go down, and this is what you're seeing here on page 11, is we're looking mostly at the expenses, because sometimes revenues come in at different times, but mostly at expenses to kind of track. Does that make sense with where we should be at this time of year? So you'll look last year, and we were the comparators there, 42%. So we're a little bit ahead of the game with respect to spending on teacher salaries. Some of that could just be the timing of when Q2 completed, but you'll look at this year, we're exactly on track. So we have zero concerns with respect respect to our spending. Administrative officers, we're, a slightly different denominator here, and so we're right on track from previous years. Education assistants, a little bit down from previous years, but right in line with where we would expect to be. Substitutes is the one area that we are concerned about. Unfortunately, we discovered a multi-year coding error in the way that we attribute some of our absences. That's actually made us realize that our substitutes, so TTOCs, our replacement EAs as examples, are actually tracking even higher than we already thought they were going to be. So, coming out of COVID, people are quicker to call in sick. The Employment Standards Act changes that give access to more sick time, but as well as just a heightened continued absenteeism with our staff. Great, they've got rights under the collective agreement under the Employment Standards Act, but the cost to the board is obviously a very significant thing. So tracking higher than we're budgeted. What that means for us is we're confident that we're going to have sufficient funds to be able to cover this year, but when we look to create next year's budget, we're now going to have to even anticipate a higher base budget with respect to that absenteeism. So overall, from a quarterly perspective, we are quite satisfied with where we are from a risk management perspective. A couple of the highlights you'll see on the revenue side: investment income's coming in higher than we anticipated. International student revenue is coming in higher than we anticipated. Enrollment also came in higher, and significantly, we had a number of additional funded students with diverse learning needs that were funded. So if I could get you to go to page 12, please, Karen. So on page 12, the top, you'll see Q1. You would have seen all of these changes in Q1. So these are additional expenses that were added to our budget, and we reported out on them. And so, for instance, we could see utilities were coming in ahead of where we thought they were from a budget perspective. We had additional space, etc. If I get you to scroll down to the bottom of the page. But here is the overall additional spending with respect to after Q2. And now we'll say at the get-go a couple of things. Q2 is really where we figure out, we stabilize our spending for the year. And so we shouldn't see significant changes in Q3 to major cost centers, but you'll see a variety of places that funding has been added. We were having significant issues in our transportation department keeping up with breakdowns and making sure that buses were available for folks. We brought in some additional support there. ISE, I've talked about additional revenue, but of course we have additional fees that we have to pay out in order to earn those additional revenues. You'll see savings in our CEF, and so for instance, that's the Classroom Enhancement Fund. What that means is that we applied for a number of staff that we had originally been paying for out of our operating fund. Those staff were supported by the ministry, and we were able to reverse them back. So that happens regularly, where we can't absolutely guarantee that it's a situation where they're going to be supported. But in here, typically we do bring back a little bit of money into staffing. And then so there's just some changes that are going to happen. So EA staffing way up because we had a significant amount of additional designated students. Lastly, I'm going to turn to page 15. And here is, and if I could just get you to scroll down to the bottom of that page, please, Karen, probably the most unprecedented number you will ever see in your time as trustees. So we had added an additional 51 FTE to our system from preliminary budget. So that is bigger than I've ever seen before. And there's a couple of things to support this. One, we have a number of ICY employees, so that's something we didn't anticipate. Significantly more supports in our EA world, which is the vast majority of the funding that you see, and then you'll see a variety of other additions as well. We also had teachers associated with CEF. So that number, and I want to put a really important asterisk here. So on a year-to-year basis, many of these positions that were added to support students may not continue year to year. I think that's pretty important to be aware of. So, you know, this number of inflated staff is not now necessarily going to continue. So you see plus 51 right now. That's an important number to keep in your mind, because in our preliminary budget, there'll likely be a negative number, because we don't know how many kids with diverse learning needs we're going to get. This year was an extraordinary year, a bit of a catch-up, as I understand, with respect to designations. Kids could have moved, kids might graduate, etc. So there will be people taken off of the roster, which is our typical process year to year. And so when you know, we're concerned about seeing, you know, minus 12 or 13 or whatever that number is going to look like in the preliminary budget, remember that 50, you know, we added 51 FTE at this time. I'm not going to touch on our capital budget. I think most of that's self-explanatory, and we don't have any concerns in any areas, but I think I've touched on the main points. Just great year for us with respect to additional revenues. ISE did great, investment income did great. Our staff did a marvelous job making sure that kids that needed to be designated were designated. And so you can just see what a benefit to the system in the form of more people in the system to support, obviously, increased complexity as well. And overall, our spending is exactly where we want it to be. So very happy with where we are at the end of Q2, and happy to answer any questions. Oh, and maybe, Chair, I could just see if Ms. Sutton would like to add anything that I missed that's glaring.
Good evening. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I can't say that I would add anything. I think you touched on all the points. I think it is just very important with regards to the staffing that this was an unprecedented year for sure, and lovely to see the supports, but you know, they are there to support the students that are in the system, and they may or may not be there next year, so that's a key point. But other than that, I think everything was summarized very well, so I have nothing else to add. Thank you.
All right, we have a couple questions. Greg?
Thank you, Anne. Hopefully my camera will turn on. There we go. So thanks for the report, Mark. I have a few questions. So I'm just wondering, on page 16 in our investment portfolio update, I'm wondering if, you know, knowing that we likely need to make a contribution to LIS projects in the future, is this money allocated, or is it targeted funding, or is this available for infrastructure projects?
Sure. So through you, Chair, every penny of it is actually spoken for in one manner or another. But so, for instance, we've got a very large balance associated with our childcare builds, but we know that those funds are going to not be spent for some time, so we can safely kind of lock them away for a higher interest rate. When we look at our capital balances, particularly on page 18, you'll see a variety of balances that are spoken for, but since they're not expended, we put them away. And the other thing we did when we chose, for instance, the longer term GIC, is we realized that the way we function is we're typically sitting, even though they're all the money spoken for, the way it flows is we're often sitting on extra funds that are spoken for but get replenished at a later time. So at this point, there's the exception of money that we would actually have set aside specifically for that purpose, or that we would want to reallocate. There's nothing additional in those dollars that could be put towards a contribution.
Thank you. That was great. Maybe I'll just put myself back on the list. Thank you.
All right, Chantel.
Greg, I was still formulating my question. You could have taken your time. So thank you for this. It's really, really great to see as well the many students that got designated this year, either diagnosed and designated or just designated. That helps really bring in a lot of funding for the school district to support them. And it like unprecedented is definitely the word for it. If we look at the later reports that we have coming, if you could explain a little bit kind of why we do this cycle, like we know that students and families do best with like consistency and routine. We get better recruitment and retention, keeping our staff. Can you explain a little bit the thought process behind the fact that we're looking at perhaps not having some of that staff for next September, and then having to rehire them if we do know, because like we know like some people will graduate and some people will leave the district, but many of those students will continue to be in here for the next few years at least. So I'm just kind of wondering that kind of thought, the reasoning behind that.
Sure. So through you, Chair. So we do know, and so that's the basis, maybe with an added tinge of conservatism in case kids do move. So it's not going to be a major cut, but we are going to be budgeting less students designated than we currently have, and so that's the direct correlation between, reversing some of the staffing that would exist. So. I don't know the exact don't have the exact number. I could get back to the board, but that's the way we go. Because the difficulty is if we miss, then we're in trouble. What I will say, however, though, is that we do kind of front end load supports in this part of our budget, and so there's almost more money than theoretically would flow to support those kids. Like if we, because the board, and I'm going to say subsidize, but subsidizes diverse learning needs with other operating dollars.
Prioritizes.
Sorry, thank you. That's the better, prioritizes. So we're actually in the spring cycle putting more money than they get funded for anyway. And so the drawdown we do is though based off of a smaller enrollment cohort. We've been trying to make that smaller, like a different delta every year, and we thought we were getting really good. And then this year happened, and we obviously designated a whole bunch more students, and so we're being less conservative than normal, if that's any help, but it is a risk management, risk mitigation strategy.
Fantastic, thank you. I just have a quick follow-up question, but it's not really a follow-up question. So I'm going to let somebody else perhaps go, and then I'll ask a question. Thanks. And thank you, Mark and Tanya. Great report. I appreciate it.
All right, Greg.
Yeah, thank you through you, Chair, to staff. One thing that struck me a little bit on page 48, where the table of summary of the grants received, and I think I just have to say is more of a comment that I can't help but notice that our district receives $160,000 in pay equity, while similar sized districts receive substantially more. So for example, the Greater Victoria is sitting at almost 2.9 million. Comox Valley at 451,000, Pacific Rim at 595,000, and Prince George, somewhat, I don't know how big they are, but I thought they'd be similar, about 2.2 million. So I know we're doing a lot of advocacy work there, and I'm grateful for that. And I just thought I should draw everyone's attention to the inequity here, and that we need to keep plugging away to try to reach parity with other like-sized districts. So thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Mark, did you want to comment?
Well, just a comment to say that's 2 reports from now, and we definitely will be coming back to that when we get to that item on the agenda. But it's absolutely correct that this district is being punished for being, not punished, sorry, this district is not being equitably treated despite taking on the social justice issue of pay equity earlier than our peers.
Thanks. Chantel, did you have a follow-up?
It's not a follow-up. Let's just call it for what it is. It's a new question. Thank you. I appreciate it. Through you, Chair, to Mark or whoever would like to answer. I noted on page 14 that we talked about the support in the complex classroom in the constrained environment. There was a co-teaching model that was sort of established here, and I think that's really fascinating. Would there be any? Would you be able to explain a little bit further about what that entails?
Yeah, sure. So, and I really want to call out Tanya and Jackie Poulin for really pushing this issue early on, and thankfully that they did. So the way that the Classroom Enhancement Fund works, so you'll recall in 2016, the collective agreement language from the early 90s came back into the collective agreement that had limitations on class size and class composition. And there was an LOU negotiated between BCPC and BCTF that said, here's all the things that you are required to do to make your best efforts to get to meet those requirements. And then there's certain circumstances, though, where you don't have to. So, for instance, if a class drops below too small a class size, et cetera, et cetera. But we, in a couple of cases, normally what we would do is add a portable in order to support another classroom. But what happened is, I think we described Fairview as a great example that we missed our projection in a big way at Fairview due to immigration. And so the impact of that, of course, was we had zero time to plan the fact that we needed additional classrooms to meet compliance requirements with respect to CEF. So we have a portable on the way, but those things take time, as we all know. And so what we did was, in order to essentially make efforts to achieve compliance, additional teachers were added without additional space being added, and that's the co-teacher model that happened. And so it's being done in a number of districts, and of course I can't tell you the educational impact. I haven't really heard about that. I can only assume it's positive, but so that stretch to make sure that we were as compliant, or trying to meet the spirit and intent of that LOU, is what led to this, and missing our target at those schools as well.
I think that's a very innovative approach for sure. And I would like to hear maybe, next year, kind of when we finish the year, to see kind of how that worked out, and see how good of positive reports from the school. Fantastic. I see that Laura Tate responded. Positive reports from the school. Great. Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate it.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, if someone would like to move the first motion. Greg?
Yes, thanks. I just scrolling up to the top so I can read it quickly. Okay. That the Business Committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, give the School District 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith 2023-2024 amended annual budget bylaw, all 3 meetings at 1 meeting on February 28, 2024.
And I see we have a seconder by Tanya. Did you want to motivate, Greg?
I don't think there's much to say. Thank you.
Okay. If anyone is opposed, could you just type it in the chat? All right, so that one passes unanimously. Is there someone willing to move the second motion? All right, Greg, go ahead.
I have it handy. It's good. Okay. That the business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68 Nanaimo Ladysmith adopt the amended annual budget of the board for the fiscal year 2023-2024 at the Board of Education meeting on February 28th, 2024.
All right, and Tanya, would you like to second that? Okay, and you're all right with that as it stands, Greg? Okay, is there anyone opposed? All right, motion carries. So moving on to 8.2, we're back with Mark and Tanya to talk about the ministry 3-year enrollment projections.
Great. So thank you, Chair. And so this is another example of quite good news for the district. And I will say, I think I said it last year, and it continues to be the case. We are a little bit of the Goldilocks district when it comes to enrollment. Some of our partners on the Lower Mainland are having significant issues keeping up with space that are just seeing humongous increases in immigration that's impacting their ability to house students, frankly. Our district is slightly different in the sense that we are still growing and relatively quickly, but at the same time, we are not, we can house the students. And so that's a good position to be in. So if you're declining or you're flat as a district, typically you're looking at service disruption because inflation comes, you've got to pay increased costs, and you have just as many or the same amount or less kids to be able to pay for that. We are projecting next year an increase of, I believe it's 233. 233 all together as a district. And so what that means is overall, we're looking at, again, slight declines in some areas, but mainly our secondaries are seeing the demographic bubble of a large elementary cohorts coming through the system. So next year, Wellington and Dover are going to, I believe, be at all-time highs. ND, ironically, we slowed just a little bit, but it will continue to be significantly at capacity. When you look at page 40, and Karen, I'll give you a second if you could open that up, please. You can see a really interesting dynamic that's happening in the system. So we were predicting demographic decline. And so you recall, a number of years ago, when Rutherford closed as an example, a demographic decline, an uptick and then a downward slope was projected. And so you still see that in the K population largely. Not a lot of domestic kids being produced as compared to previous years. So for instance, if you look at our grade 9 cohort in the 2023-24 year, 1,040 kids, and you look at our K, 956. If you make that happen over a number of years, we're going to be declining. But due to immigration, what it looks like is that our Ks are not really impacted because it's still, the domestic population largely relying on per Ks, but we are seeing some kind of immigration fill in some of those gaps that might exist in the 1 to 7 range, and then really big bubble coming for our secondaries. And so you see that this is the biggest year for us on projection, but then you look at our secondaries in particularly in 26-27, it's going to continue to be a significant issue with respect to capacity. And so obviously we have some desires to fix that at ND, and we've got some requests at Wellington to be explored. So over 3 years, though, you'll see 268, 265, and 112. A little bit smaller because of declines in other areas of the district next year, but still 232. So very good news for us to be able to base our budget off of. Remember, this is not including international students. Nanaimo Ladysmith still continues to be a growth area subject to the space limitations at our secondaries. So happy to answer any questions, but generally this gives you a good sense, barring a major shift in the way that the ministry funds us, that we should be looking reasonably good when it comes to the budget time. With the caution, though, we do have Rutherford opening, which is a very expensive operational hit, not this year but the year after, to think about, and we still have inflation to pay for.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone have any questions? Tanya?
Thank you, Chair. Mark, just because I was talking to somebody and they asked me this question, there's a bit of confusion about what we've been hearing in the news about an international student quota system. Is that, my understanding was that's not on us, that's about, because it's to do with housing, that's the only going to really impact, it's going to impact the universities, not so much us. Am I accurate in that?
Yeah, so there's I guess two impacts that it would have. One, it has no impact on our international program. So there's no restriction on the number of international students in the secondary context, to your point, because they all are housed with people with homes. We can't bring them unless they have homes. So that doesn't cause any issues there. Where it could have a negative impact on us is that people that become international students that bring children with them, there will be less of those people. So we could be impacted in a negative way by having less funded domestic or funded students based off of their international access. However, we're not greatly concerned about that because, you know, 4-year programs, I can only imagine our local institutions are going to prioritize those students. The last piece is there could actually be a benefit to us, in that we also understand that if you are a school district, or sorry, if you are a university and the student is applying from Canada for a extension of their student permit, then they don't count against the cap. And this is preliminary at this point. What that means is there's every incentive theoretically for a university to say, great, let's put you in grade 11 and 12 in Nanaimo, you can graduate, and then all of a sudden you can come to us without counting against us. So we're just trying to get a sense of the impact on that in a positive way, and if that's something that might benefit the district.
Thank you. No follow-up, thanks.
Thanks, Tanya. Mark, I don't see any other questions, so we can move on to 8.3, operating grant funding update.
Great, thank you. And so this, I believe we had put in the business agenda last month that was canceled due to snow. So I don't really have a lot to talk about here because we just did talk about the Q2. And so a lot of the impact of the final funding it did come in at that particular point, but I do want to touch on a couple of points, and one is on page 46. Karen, if you could turn to page 46. And so you'll see there's a bit of a discussion on this page, but just the little box with the CEF overhead. So the CEF, the Classroom Enhancement Fund, as I noted, came back in 2016, and there was 3 aspects to the Classroom Enhancement Fund. There was for teachers, and so that's to meet the requirements of the language, and so that continues and grows a bit every year, seemingly. There was a huge pot of capital dollars to create space. That was a one and done situation. And then there was an overhead component. So what the idea was is districts got together internally and said, okay, well, if we're going to hire 100 new teachers, we're going to need HR staff to do it. If we're going to have more space in our schools, we're going to need more custodial. So those not direct teaching costs were put into overhead. The problem, however, and if you look at 2018 to 2024, there's not only did it decline, it did not keep up with inflation. And so there's some issues of how the ministry, you know, funded settlement costs this year. But for us, more importantly, there's some issues associated with the overall costs and what the CEF is actually paying for. And so if you have multiple jobs in the CEF overhead fund, as an example, we start to subsidize them out of our operating fund because there's just not enough to pay for everything that we've attributed to the overhead. So we'll probably bring in some issue associated with this to the board in the budget period. We don't quite know what it looks like yet. It's just important to be aware of. And then I just would reiterate Greg's earlier point about the pay equity. The pay equity has not shifted this year. We don't know if it's going to shift next year, but we are, I believe, the second or third most impacted negatively in the entire province. If you add up the discrepancy in the amount of money this district missed out on in the last 22, 23 years, we're talking, you know, in the tune of $30 million probably, and you can only imagine what the impact on supports for kids in Nanaimo would have been had we been funded for, again, what this district did, addressing a social justice issue earlier than most districts across the province. So just very important to remember the steps that Nanaimo took and the ultimate ramifications for doing so. Happy to answer any questions, but there's really not much additional from the quarterly.
Thanks, Mark. I don't see any questions. We're letting you off easy tonight. So we'll move on to 8.4, policy 3.8, transportation to and from school.
Great, thank you. And so this is coming back from the board recommending it go back to the policy committee and then to the business committee, because there was some feedback on the original transportation, what was originally called transportation, renamed, proposed to be renamed to transportation to and from school. Most of the commentary that the community provided was associated with kind of individualized circumstances associated with transportation. And I think in our next presentation, Ms. Mowat will actually probably address that specifically. When the policy committee got back together, there was one kind of recognition that's with respect to idling, because we are addressing, you know, transportation to and from school, as well as our parking situation and active transportation. And so what was added was just a belief statement that the board believes that schools should be idle-free and supports infrastructure to educate our community in meeting the goal. And the policy impact of that change is intended to essentially say to facilities, okay, great, you're doing the parking lot, you're upgrading something, you're upgrading this, let's make sure that there's signage available. What it's not intended to do is tell principals or other staff, it's time to go police this with our parents. We just don't have the capacity to do it. So we do have we have internal procedures with respect to our own staff on idling. This is not thou shalt not idle community and we're going to make you stop. This is an educative, goal to align on infrastructure and what we believe. Maybe that changes in the future, but it wasn't intended to add additional work to staff at school sites.
Great, thanks, Mark. I don't see any questions in there, but I do see that Tanya is happy to move the recommendation.
I've got it right here. I just pushed it wrong. There we go. That the business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District Number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, adopt amended policy 3.8, transportation to and from school.
And we have Tom seconding it. Tanya, did you want to motivate?
No, I think that Mark has given a pretty good explanation. It's a good change, and I think that it is in line with our board goals.
Great. Tom, you have a comment?
Yeah, just if I recall correctly, thank you, Chair, through you to Mark. Our idle-free edition, that was as a result of a public contribution, wasn't it? Wasn't there a letter to that effect from? I
believe so. Certainly it came as a result of the policy committee discussing the feedback from our community.
Yeah, I just wanted to really acknowledge that, you know, there was great feedback from the community and it was really timely, and I appreciate the public's input, and it's a great addition to the policy.
Thanks, Tom. Greg?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Through you to, I guess no one, I'm going to speak in favor of the motion, actually. Just wanted to thank the business committee. I mean, yeah, we're hopefully supporting the motion, but also the policy committee for the work and staff and their support. I'm pleased to see in our new policy, hopefully that will be supported this evening, being able to clarify, and we'll see this, you know, going forward into the next item, the yearly transportation review and the role of the board and the role of staff, which is nice from my perspective. I also really like the direction around collaboration with regional transit and some direction around active transportation and school pickup and drop off. So these are all sort of newer things that I think will make a difference in the district, and I'm happy to support the motion. So thank you.
Thanks, Greg. So we'll move to call the question. If there's anyone opposed to approval of the motion, if you could type it in the chat. Right, motion carries unanimously. So moving to 8.5 is the talk around transportation route review with Mark Walsh and Pete Sable, our Executive Director of Planning and Operations, as well as Tracy Mowat, the Transportation Manager.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just going to briefly kick it off. A couple of points to make. First, I just want to recognize the work of our transportation department, everyone, Tracy and her team. It's been a tough year. We've had staffing shortages with respect to, ironically, not bus drivers, but to mechanics. That's putting severe strain on our system. Unfortunately, fortunately and fortunately, we're leaders in electric buses. But we're also leaders in having our electric buses not functioning necessarily the way that we want them to. And so we're working through a lot of those problems, which is impacting our ability to serve students. And just a kudos to say that the work that the department has done has led to very minimal impact on our students. And so it's been a huge amount of effort, and I really want the board to be aware of what the team has done to come together to make the impact as small as possible on our students, and express appreciation for our maintenance team who have been so patiently waiting for us to fill mechanic positions. The second piece I just want to note is that this is largely aligned, particularly when you get to the end of the report and see what is being determined, largely aligned with the policy that the board just passed. And what you're going to see is really no major changes. I'll let Tracy talk about what the thinking was and how they came about. We're not proposing any removal of routes. There's obviously some small changes being done, but so no controversy for you this evening. So the good news continues to flow. But I'll turn it over to Pete and Tracy if they want to briefly touch on it, and then just be available for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Secretary Treasurer Walsh, and good evening. And I wanted to touch on one item and then have a chance to echo some of Mark's comments. Karen, if you could go to page, or Miss Matthews, if you could go to page 62 of the PDF. And on it, what trustees will see is the result of the analyzation of the 23-24 bus route data. And right, and you'll see on there a number of red boxes and a number of associated white boxes below it in those two columns. And what that information shows is that if a trip, they're grouped into trips of a route, and you'll see that any trip, AM or PM, that is below 50% is noted in red. And part of the key thing of the annual route review is to analyze this data to see which routes are under 50% utilization, and then have a close look at those routes to determine if there's any recommendations arising out of that. And if you scroll down a little bit, Miss Matthews, you'll see the recommendation at the bottom, and essentially, keep going a little bit more, surprisingly, 30 of the 64 trips were operating below 50%. However, there were only 2 routes where all trips were running underutilized. And those 2 trips did not, one is remote and one is a trip for our Quanquam-Stelelith school. And there's no opportunity to reduce that utilization. The only thing we could do is consider the bus size on it, which would not change the students, but change the utilization route. And one might say, how could that happen? But listed below, there are a number of reasons why staff, after looking at those routes, didn't come up with any route any route recommendations. And before I pass it over to Tracy, I would like to echo Mark's comments and say how much I appreciate Tracy and her staff's effort this year through all of the challenges that were thrown at them. And it just seems continually thrown at them. And I'm hoping we're reaching a point where some of those challenges will get on top of them and they'll stop coming at us so we can all take a deep breath and move on. So I know Tracy wants to talk a little bit about more of some of the details that she looked at, and I'll pass it over to her.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for all the kind words that have been thrown my way. I appreciate that very much. If I could just speak a little bit more about the process. We have the annual route review, and part of it is to go through and review all of our routes to determine where they're at and where we might make any changes, as been mentioned. And it's also been developing into sort of a more fulsome report of the whole department and what we're experiencing. And as Mark mentioned earlier, staffing concerns have been the biggest. We are managing to keep just enough bus drivers to keep everything running, but the mechanic situation has been difficult. We did hire one that just started at the beginning of last week. So he's, a week and a half in, and so all is doing well there. But we are still actually missing one mechanic. So that has been quite challenging for us in the department. But we are also looking at potentially looking to do an apprenticeship position. We have one staff member that's been filling in as a helper, and he shows great aptitude. And so we're working closely with the union on that. We'd really like to see if we can't put together our first apprentice mechanic. The other thing that the route review does for us is it allows me to have an avenue when we have requests or concerns that come in from the public, from parents, generally speaking, about services that they would like to see enhanced or changed. And one that is of mention is on Gabriola. There were a number of letters that came in through email. I think one went through the board and then to me. And so I kind of, on page 9 of the report, there is a review of what those requests were. So we have a pretty big route on Gabriola, one that goes around and picks up the high school kids to come to NDSS, but then a second trip around to go to Gabriola Elementary. And it's the Gabriola Elementary that they've been asking for additional service through some of the areas that we don't go into. We pass by on the main road, but we don't go into their areas, and they had hoped we would maybe extend that. I put in there sort of what the result of that would be for us. And so at this point, I'm not recommending any change. It's a very underutilized bus route as it is, but it's a very long bus route, and so extending it would be not beneficial to the kids that are currently on it. And I guess I'm just really opening it up to anyone that wants to ask questions about it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Naomi, I see you have a question.
Hi, Tracy, and hi, Pete. Thanks for your very detailed report. I have to say it's very complex. figuring out routes and the struggle to find mechanics, etc. I just have to say, like, I was really shocked by how underutilized buses are. Like, the one statistic was there's 2,126 registered students for busing, and only 929 on average are using it per day. And then on Gabriola, you just mentioned only 29% capacity. You know, we're talking about like environmental sustainability. We've got a committee, we've got a mission, you know, to reduce carbon. And I'm just wondering, like, I know last year we debated this. How do we get people to like use the bus more and etc. And I voted again. I admit I voted against a user fee for the bus. I just did. But I'm wondering if it's possible. Have you guys thought of other ways? Because my concern is I see there are students that, what did you call them? What is it? Courtesy ridership. Right? And so the challenges with that is if you have all these people who have registered to use the bus, can't use it. Do you have have you guys brainstormed any other ideas as a result of last year when we decided against the user fee?
I think it's so, again, through the chair, back to Naomi. Pete, did you want to answer that, or do you want me to say anything?
Yeah.
I saw you come on board, so I thought maybe I'd let you.
Yeah. Reductions of routes and considering utilization is always something that's on our mind. Very challenging to, increase the utilization and not affect service. So Tracy has outlined in one of the statistics how many students are considered poor walk condition related, and how many of those courtesy seats are considered true courtesy, where people are using the bus, but they're not necessarily because of a pre-identified poor walk condition. So there are opportunities to reduce the number of buses and increase utilization. They would include affecting the people who could ride the bus, the students who could ride the bus. And that would also mean that we would need to look more fulsomely at the entire bus system. And we have some routing software now that we're putting in place that would have to reprogram the runs to take a look at that. So that's not something that we were proposing this year. However, it was a topic of discussion that if we're having problems with buses and we're not able to run as many buses, is reducing the routes to match our ability to provide busing one way of addressing them.
And perhaps I can add to that as well, as when we did present that fee idea last year, we also did suggest that we would be more actively following up with students who sign up and don't ride to take that ridership away. Now, Tracy, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I know how busy you are, so that's probably not been a priority, but perhaps you can comment on that strategy.
Yeah. So in all honesty, we haven't followed up, but we've talked about doing it. Because we do have a couple of routes where they're over capacity, but they're in areas where we actually are taking eligible riders. And so what happens is the courtesy riders, everywhere that they are, except in one situation, they're not really affecting that run. They're actually giving it a higher percentage of users. So, it's looking at where those courtesy riders are in relationship to the actual capacity of the buses. And like I say, most of them are on routes that they actually have lots of room for them. So.
Thank you. I have a follow-up. It's kind of a follow-up. I'm cheating a little bit, but thanks for that answer. And I can only imagine how busy you are to be able to go and start tracking who's using the bus and who isn't. Takes a lot of time. Just a comment, and then I'll ask my question. It's just that I feel really sad that, we have buses, we have the routes, and yet kids are still getting rides to school. We want to reduce our carbon footprint. Somehow I think we have to try to promote going back to using the school bus, you know, to its full capacity. At any rate, my next question was around when you're hiring bus drivers. You mentioned in the report, which I thought was kind of neat, you talked about the student management piece, which I think is very important in this day and age. I'm wondering, like you mentioned, what you said that they would attend some ProDs like for their training. What kind of ProDs are you talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, we do a variety of training, but in the behavior management, we do have our busing association, which is called ASTS BC, school buses in BC. They actually have a training program that has modules in it, and one of the modules is actually on student behavior. So that's a program that I put on a couple of times. You know, and then I've done my own versions. So when we have Pro D times, when we have meeting days, we try to incorporate this type of training with them, because there's so many scenarios. You know, it's so gray on how to manage students on a bus. And in every scenario, you know, requires a little bit of investigation to say, well, what should you do? How could you manage that? So we do revisit it quite regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tracy and Pete. Oh, Pete, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I did want to add that recently we've increased conversations with Learning Services, Jackie Poulin and Dawn Belcombe, to speak a little bit about student management, to make sure that we're aligned with schools management and that we have the correct protocols, and we'll be looking to them as well to see if there's any additional Pro-D that they can assist with or suggest.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And we did professional boundaries as well. Mark actually did that course for us. So he presented that to all of our bus drivers.
Wonderful. Keep up the good work.
Mark Robinson, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Great to see you, Pete. Thank you, Tracy and Pete, for the report. I was very blessed in having gone through facilities not too long ago. Thank you, Pete, for the tour. My question is regarding the underutilized routes, specifically the ones that are in the red. I'm just wondering, Mark mentioned that they were thinking of, or was it Pete? I think it was Mark that mentioned it, trying to reach out at some point to the students that have signed up, but haven't been using it. I'm wondering if we have the data or statistics regarding kids that are in the area, who live in the area, not just the ones that signed up, but the ones who didn't sign up, and sort of take them aside or speak to them or survey them or their parents or reach out through email or what have you to say, hey, you know, how come you're not using the bus? What's going on? What can we do? So I guess not only the ones that have signed up, but the ones that haven't signed up. And do we have the data that shows, you know, say there's 28 kids taking the bus, but there's 58 students in the area that could take the bus?
So we would have the data through your chair through different programs. So we have a Beauregard system that shows us the exact location of each student. I do not believe that the transportation department actually has access to that program. Pete does, but also that's not a step that we've taken. And then the one thing to contemplate in that too is as much as we want to make sure the buses are utilized, if we overutilize them, we're in trouble fast, right? So we could not add another route based off of demand to our system right now. And so there is a certain amount of balance. Obviously, we don't want them underutilized, but there is a risk if we promote the service too much, and then the expectation gets built that that's available. So I would add a little level of caution before we kind of did that level of advertisement, I guess.
Sure, no, I can appreciate that. Okay, yeah.
And I do want to recognize that, you know, most of the routes, they have several trips to them, and they're on, some of the trips are underutilized, but not all of the trips. So there's only actually 2 of the routes that are completely underutilized, and that was the Gabriola and the QQS. So the rest of them do have, you know, a significant amount of students riding on them, and that may be the main purpose that that route is there, but that we've then added, instead of paying transportation assistance, for instance, to Dover from sort of the Pleasant Valley catchment, we do a second run that's maybe underutilized, but it's still better than having transportation assistance and having all those cars on the road. So I think sometimes there's times when they're, you know, underutilized is okay as well.
Agreed. Absolutely. Thanks, Tracy.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that sort of answered my question. I'll follow up later on. Thank you.
Tom, you're next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Pete, and thank you, Tracy, for your report and your wonderful work. I had a couple of questions about just how the process goes when we're doing these kind of reviews and route capacities. And not knowing the geographical spread of our routes, I might be shooting in the dark here, but are there any areas where our service overlaps with regional transit that, you know, and I'm thinking that might be more complicated with elementary, but with our secondary kids, if we're getting into any kind of routes that are low user profile, have low usage, and are also on RDN routes, I'm just wondering if there isn't room to kind of collaborate on capacity there. I hate to see 2 underused buses going through the same neighborhoods. That's kind of what I'm envisioning as a worst case scenario. So I'll let you speak to that and whether our relationship with RDN Transit comes into our thinking when we're looking at routes.
It absolutely does, and that's part of the reason that we are meeting with them, just looking to have those conversations and find any opportunities that might be out there to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll also add that in the past, we have in fact eliminated a trip off a route along a transportation corridor. And that was up feeding off Hammond Bay, feeding Dover Bay. That was a number of years ago. So we have picked at some low-hanging fruit, and we meet now 3 times a year with the RDN transit staff, and we're continuing to have discussions about services and possible overlapping, possible future service improvements, understanding where they're changing their routes and how that might assist us. Also talking a little bit about some of the problems we have and they have, which is lack of mechanics, and you know, finding out that they have many mechanics and many vacant positions, and they're looking to increase the salary for their mechanics, which of course may draw away from our ability to hire mechanics. So we're working together to make sure we're not too far at cross purposes as well.
I really appreciate that collaborative, you know, systems-wide approach to transportation in our region. You know, I think if we're going to tackle this in an efficient way, in an environmentally friendly way, we have to be working together. So I really appreciate that. My second question, if I may, Chair. No, I think I should go back on the list. This is totally different. So I'm going to go back on the list. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Chantel?
Great questions, everybody, and great answers. I love this report. I love the, collaboration with the RDN. I love the student management piece as well. Thank you for elaborating on that. Really appreciate it. The onboard video systems, I noticed here that it's kind of flagged that like there's some upgrading that needs to happen here. Is this something that I'm not quite sure how your budget works and things like that. Should we be looking out for that as a budget line item coming up in the future? Because that to me is really, really helpful to have in a bus, and it's a critical component to it. Could you be able to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, through the chair, maybe I could jump in and have the first crack at it. So Tracy's been speaking to myself, and I've involved Brian Ackwood, who's assisting me with video systems in schools, and we've had an initial opportunity to take a look at the video system in the fleet and start to try and understand the issues and the enormity getting our mind around the scope. Unfortunately, priorities have crept up, and both for us on the assistance side for Tracy and Tracy herself with time. And we're hoping to get back to that and have a look. With respect to budgeting, the department has a number of different mechanisms at its disposal to begin with. And then, you know, we can attempt to use those and prioritize the funds that we have and look at a phased increase or phased change to the busing system. That's not unlike how we manage a number of our systems in the district. If we do get into some budgeting problems with systems, I often approach Secretary Treasurer Walsh for assistance, but at this point, it's too early in our work to determine, you know, where we're at with the budget or the plan for the replacement. So we just wanted to let folks know that it is an aging system and that it has been causing some difficulties at a time when we're facing other difficulties. So we're also trying to increase the system, make it more user-friendly. And of course, all electronics require capital renewal at some time. So thank you.
Yeah, a lot of fires to be put out. Transportation is huge. It's kind of the backbone of getting people to and from. And I really appreciate the hard work you've done. I do have another question, but I'm going to put myself back on the list. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom is up next. I'm just going to squeak in with my question, Tom, just before you. And it's just around underutilization, but more specifically in just making sure that we have a mechanism to make sure that we have the ability to hear students that are maybe not riding the bus for various reasons, i.e. they don't feel safe on the bus for whatever reason that may be. I'm just wondering if that has come into play. I know that's really hard to gauge, but I feel like there could potentially be a couple of routes maybe where there's like, you know, specific instances where there's a group of kids that just don't feel comfortable riding the bus for whatever reason. And I just hope that we can make sure that their concerns are heard so that they're able to use it.
Sorry, I'm just wondering what the question was in there. I'm sorry, Leanne.
Like, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. I'm just wondering, like, because sometimes it's children, but sometimes it could also be an adult that's on the bus, right? Like maybe there's some sort of issue either way with, you know, some sort of conflict. And I'm just hoping that there's a mechanism that students can express those concerns and they can be like handled appropriately.
Maybe I could speak to that. I'm not an expert on how students get their concerns brought forward within the system. However, Tracy does have her ear to the ground with respect to issues on buses that come via the drivers and issues on buses that come via the school and or through the public. And that's our main mechanism. We do not solicit students in any way, haven't to ask them if they're safe, put up a poster, here's what you do if you're feeling unsafe on a bus, or talk to schools about, you know, have they looked for students who, you know, maybe did ride the bus but don't anymore, and to determine the reasons why. But we do actively listen, and when we do hear of issues through whatever mechanism, we do act upon them.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So we'll go back to Tom.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, I wanted to ask and kind of support. I know that we threw a big challenge to transportation by transitioning to our electric buses. It's something that the board really believes in, and you can see how Secretary Treasurer Walsh has gone out of his way to get us some wheels. I want to start by, you know, thanking you for taking on what is you know, a generational challenge in trying to bring on board this new technology. I think it's important work, but no doubt it has its challenges, and it's probably pretty frustrating. So I'll start with a thank you to both of you for taking that on, and then I'll also just follow up with what can the board do to ensure that this transition continues and that you have the support you need to see it through.
Maybe I'll jump in first there. We feel very supported by the board at this time and by the Walsh and Secretary Treasurer Walsh and other senior management of the district. We also feel very supported by the Ministry of Education, and in fact, we're going to be meeting with the Ministry of Education in the next few weeks to specifically talk about buses, talk about some of the things on the horizon that Tracy and I see that might become obstacles to continuing with the EV program. One of them is the range of the program of the buses. You know, one of them is the capacity of the current EV buses. One of them is the challenges of the buses. Another is the charging infrastructure for the bus fleet and the cost of that. And they are challenges are numerous, but at this point, I'm not certain how I would answer the question about trustees' support. We feel like we have the support enabling us to continue to pursue the program to its greatest extent, which essentially the greatest extent in our minds would mean we never buy another fossil fuel bus again. And so that's kind of our goal. And it's only when we come across a insurmountable obstacle that, you know, perhaps then we might reach out to the board and let them know what's happening in that regard.
You can't hear what I said.
No.
I guess, thank you very much, Pete. It's great to hear that you're feeling that support, because I know it's the board feels. We're strongly behind our environmental plan, and our transportation department is a huge part of that. So thank you for that, and yeah, best of luck.
Greg.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Chair, to staff. Just looking at some of the capacity numbers, I was just curious, when we plan routes, like what would the impact be if a higher percentage rode the bus? Like, is our capacity that we plan for based on a full load, and we just, you know, I mean, them knowing, of course, that we would always have enough seats, or do we kind of base it on the number that we think might ride in a particular route, hoping that not everybody shows up in the morning, kind of thing?
I'll go ahead with that one. So, I mean, year over year, the numbers do roll out to be about the same. We know that we probably only get 50% of the people that register actually ride. So we know those numbers, and we plan around that. So when we're setting up a bus route, and I know that there's, you know, 110 kids on that bus, and I can only take 65, I know that that's probably still going to be manageable, because I know that that's how many kids are not going to show up. And so, yeah, so, and that's typical throughout the province. That's not just here in Nanaimo. It is a standard that you just kind of get to know. And, you know, we want them at full capacity. And so we try to, you know, get them to the point where they're full, but we don't have an overflow situation. And occasionally we do end up in that overflow, and then we have to have contingency plans that we rely on. So, but yeah, we kind of know from year to year they're going to be about the same numbers. We look at the numbers that are estimated for the different schools, the growth plans, to see if we might be expecting certain areas to grow as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Chantel?
I'm not going to talk about the routes anymore, but I will talk about the new bus routing software. I mean, that sounds like it's going to be, it's doing some good stuff here. It's doing some great work for you all. Would you be able to expand a little bit more on that? And is that something that, because I know as a parent looking at the bus routes, it can be kind of difficult to understand. Will there be something coming out, being rolled out for families where they could actually see the route and stuff like that? that when they go to register their child or whatever, they can see the route and everything, and how that kind of all works out, so that they can plan
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, so one of the
Great.
things that the routing software does is it actually will take the address of the student and, you know, assign it to a very specific stop. And so then it will also create a report that tells the parent exactly what time their bus is coming by and where the stop is, all that information. And we can print those out very quickly and easily. And so my intent would be in the new year to be giving those reports to the school to be handing out to the kids so that they know exactly when and where they get on the bus. Prior to that, they just had to figure out where their closest stop was and show up. So I think this will be a really significant improvement in that regard for them. Yeah.
Agreed. I think it's fantastic, and it's great too for the younger stuff. So
Indeed.
kind of can alleviate a lot of that anxiety and stuff, and I really appreciate it. I hope it really helps you all in your extremely complex work that you do on a daily basis. Thank you very
Thank you.
much for all your hard work.
All right, Naomi.
I just have one last question, and it's just more of a curiosity that you have the electric buses. So how do you maintain those? Like, what do you do for when you have an issue with them? Obviously your mechanics on regular, they're not trained for that, right? So I'm just wondering, what do you do?
Yeah. So because they're so new, of course, they've been on warranty mostly. Two of our first two ones have just come off of some of their warranty. So we have dealerships that we deal with, and we work very closely with them. Sometimes they send techs here to do the work for us. Or they will talk to our mechanics on the phone. But there have been programs coming out on training for EV. So I mentioned the association, they have a conference once a year, and they put on some really great training programs for the mechanics, and they have been including EV training in those programs. And so we're slowly getting our mechanics to a point where they do know and understand the different components of an electric vehicle. We have a training program one of the dealers is putting on in Surrey at the end of this month, and I have one of the mechanics going over to partake in that. So slowly, as the training becomes available in the marketplace, and even I think BCIT now has a course, and we will be looking at professional development for the mechanics to increase their skills on that. But mostly it's, they've been under warranty, so we've been, having the dealerships actually take care of most of the problems so far.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. I think we've exhausted our questions for this evening, so thank you so much for the report and all of the great information that you provided us. So moving on to 8.6, the Ladysmith seismic update by Secretary Treasurer Mark Welsh.
Thank you, Chair, and have a good evening, Tracy. Feel free to log off. So we presented to the last board meeting the official approval, so the next step down the line with respect to the seismic upgrade in Ladysmith Intermediate. And so this is quite a long-term process, and if the board will recall, we went out to the community and put a bunch of options that dealt with both the seismic issue, but as well as some capacity issues and the community in Ladysmith's kind of desires for education. We heard quite strongly support for a reopening of a school in the southern part of Ladysmith, and a desire to bring French immersion back. So in a seismic upgrade, we get the money to seismically upgrade the facility that's at issue, and in this case is Ladysmith Intermediate. That school is old. It has rundown systems, systems at the end of life. It's not an accessible facility, and it's not really conducive to modern learning. So the idea of plowing $25 million to get really this similar building at the end of the day, nicer of course, is maybe not the most optimal for the next 50 or 60 or 70 years of education in that part of the district. So what the ministry will do, however, is allow the board to spend the equivalent of that amount on seismic to get the same spaces somewhere else if it would like, in the form of potentially a replacement. Normally that's on site, and in this case, an on-site facility is also a possibility. But again, based off of what we heard from the community, something slightly different is desired, particularly given the growth in the southern part of Ladysmith as well. So what the ministry, though, will do is then it will ask the board to say, okay, great, we will give you the money for the seismic, the cheapest option that you put forward, and you pay the difference. So we're looking, and it's not a final number, but we're looking between about a $7 and $9 million difference between Ladysmith just seismically upgrade and building a new facility on Davis Road. So this wouldn't involve upgrading the facility that exists. It would involve tearing it down and building a new. So there's a bunch of benefits to that. Kids don't have to live on a construction site. They don't need to be bused to Woodbank for the year or two that it takes to upgrade the facility. So there's lots of benefits for the existing kids at Ladysmith. So what would happen is we'd open Davis Road as a K-7 French immersion, and then we would open or change Ladysmith Primary into another K-7 because we have expansion dollars. But the board, again, ultimately is going to be required to find some portion thereof, if not the entirety of the difference between the low and the high cost option. So we already talked to the community about possibly, having to dispose of the Ladysmith Intermediate site at the time that it's complete. So I don't think that's a big surprise there. And that's probably about $3 million. I will say there is some good news. And so if the board will recall, we completed Solaire, we completed Pleasant Valley, and we completed Dover Bay, all under budget. What happens when you become under budget is that those dollars flow into what's called ministry restricted capital. And so we need the ministry's permission to spend that money, but we could make a recommendation or a request to spend the money on Ladysmith. That's up to about $2.5 million more dollars. So that puts us already at 5.5. So this idea of missing an opportunity to do something really great, a generational change to public education in the Ladysmith area is something that obviously the board, I think, is generally supportive of. However, there's a delta still. And so before the district goes and spends a bunch of money on, finding a plan, getting valuations of land, because land sale would be potentially part of it, we thought we would come to the board with the recommended motion that's put forward there. There's still time for us to get the exact number and talk to the ministry about what that looks like. But there is a realistic opportunity for us to do something. So the recommended motion is there, and I'd happy to answer any questions with respect to that. Our intention, if the recommended motion would pass, would be to turn this information over on a relatively expedited basis so the board can make a decision pretty fast and we can get our ducks in a row for final approval, and then we get to planning.
Thanks, Mark. I see that I have somebody who's willing to move the motion. Is there anyone that has a question before I do that, or are we fine to move ahead with that? Okay, go ahead, Naomi.
The business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, direct staff to create a report with options to gather funds to support the higher cost option for Ladysmith Intermediate seismic upgrade, Davis Road, and report back to the board for approval.
Thank you, and I see that Tanya has seconded. Naomi, would you like to motivate?
Yes, I would like to motivate this. Yeah, so I grew up in Ladysmith. I lived in Yellow Point, actually, grew up in Ladysmith, ended up teaching the high school and taught at North Oyster, and I have a real connection to the community. Having visited the intermediate school recently, it just struck me as how old it is. And it's not a very functional school in terms of accessibility. And I really do I feel that we really need to move in a direction of getting a new build in Ladysmith. So I fully support this motion.
Sorry, Naomi, I've allowing you a second to pause. It seemed like you might want to say something else.
Yeah, no, yeah, I know it was kind of a weird, I just kind of finished it. No, I just really support this motion. We need to build a new school in Ladysmith. There's ways that we have to do it. Mark has, Secretary Treasurer has outlined them. And I really would like to just get moving on this and head in the direction of a new build for Ladysmith, the community of Ladysmith.
Great, thanks, Naomi. Greg?
Oh boy, thank you. Yeah, through you, I'll be speaking in favor of the motion. I know how important it is to the community of Ladysmith that we do our best to try and make the Davis Road option a reality. And I know that it might not be easy, but I think it would be a shame for us not to try and do our best to get across the finish line. And I just think it's the perfect opportunity for us to make a significant positive contribution that would be lasting in Ladysmith. And I think it's the right thing for our students. So I'm hopeful this will pass. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find a way to make it happen. And then just getting behind staff to support the process. So definitely be in favor. So thank you.
Thanks, Greg. I'd just like to add that I also support the motion, and I support moving as quickly as we possibly can. As we all know, these things take a significant amount of time, and this community has been waiting a long time. So I'm very happy to move this forward as quickly as we possibly can. I don't see anybody else that wants to speak. Leanna supports this as well. So if you are opposed, I would just like you to type that in the chat. All right, motion carries. So moving on to correspondence, there is none, no unfinished business, no new business. Just for information purposes, you'll note 12.1, the budget calendar is attached. So as we move into the budget season, that's just an outline for how we will progress with those conversations. That calendar will be attached to every business committee meeting moving forward as we move through that. Are there any questions, Karen? No questions. All right, so I will look for a motion to adjourn. All right, Greg and Naomi. All right, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you for